Welcome back to Finding the Edge podcast. I'm Garrett Boyum, joined with Garrett Baker. It's been a minute since you've been on, and today we wanted to go over. We all have seen the Sport Movement Skill Conference, and these two were at it. Baker presented at it, so we wanted to do just a debrief on it and like kind of promote the event. People should come next year and all that sort of stuff. But so have on Baker's fellow coworker, AJ Ferrara. I don't know if you guys want to do a little brief intros, especially for you, AJ, because we haven't had you on the podcast before. So who's AJ?
Sure. First, Boyum, thanks for having me. Garrett, good to see you. The way I got connected with Baker is I was kind of his henchman analyst guy working with the Mets. And so we had some great discussions kind of chatting about EcoD frameworks and playing parkour together, doing everything under the sun. So pleasure to be on here, kind of continue the conversation. Played ball, D3 ball back at Johns Hopkins, and then studied engineering, was kind of doing some software engineering right out of college, transitioned more into analytics role, and kind of, thanks to Baker, got my mind looped around the idea of integrating EcoD more into sports and life. So I've been pretty fascinated by that recently.
I guess I owe you an apology for pulling you down into this, but no, I mean we've had probably, if anybody goes and watches the SMSC and sees my talk, my parkour training partner, which I talk about a little bit, tied in with baseball, was AJ the entire year. So we basically just moved around, jumped on walls, looked kind of foolish to random onlookers on Florida, just going for their nice Florida morning stroll down in Port St. Lucie. But we had some nice EcoD talks, and then here we are wrapping up the SMSC, which again, Garrett kind of talked about, and we'll talk about as we go forward here, I'm sure. But like great event, and I highly suggest anybody to go check it out. Not just because I spoke, but because like there's good talk after good talk, and how they set it up 20 minutes at a time, which is really good. So if you don't have a ton of time, like you can grab 20 minutes worth of a talk and then come back later for more. A little TED Talk style. So I think the event was really well done and a lot of good ideas shared.
Do you want to briefly, because there was an in-person part this year, do you kind of want to talk about like your guys' experience real quick of like what was your guys' overall experience, especially being at the in-person part? Because I think, hopefully in the future, there's more people that come to the in-person part, because there's something about being in person, being able to really interact with others, really creates a different experience, and you can learn so much more by being there in person. And so I want to kind of hear what was your guys' experience with that, because I think this is the first year that they've done it like, part online and part in person in such an intimate setting. Yeah, the first one was all in person, all that sort of stuff, but I think I'm kind of curious, like what your guys' experience with this was. Was it similar to, other ones like in person, or was there anything unique about this setup?
This was the first in person I've been to, so maybe Garrett can add some more context. But I thought it was really good from the standpoint of the TED Talk style presentations were great exposure to different concepts, but where you really learn and start to integrate them into your own framework is when you actually get to interact with them with other people, keeping those conversations. I know that in the in-person, we did a bunch of that, chatting with people, getting to hear the things that they're working through with other participants. And then also we had our back channels as well, where both Garrett's, we had great conversations off the sides. And that's really where you start to integrate it into your actual knowledge base and find ways to apply it, is by interacting with those ideas you're exposed to in the actual sessions.
Yeah, the in-person, I think, compared to most in-persons, is a lot more intimate. And it's really cool since it's kind of like a hot stove type deal, where you go through all these talks throughout the day and then you meet up in a little more intimate group setting. And you can either talk through some of the concepts that you heard today or that day, or you can talk through just anything on your mind. And I think the one cool thing that Sean and Tyler did is really take us through some practical things. Even like they took us through an entire warm up and how they may potentially structure a warm up, or how they may potentially structure some kind of practice design. And it wasn't, they're on the football side of things, but then they opened it up for any other coach there to present their practice design, and then all the other coaches can pitch in and ways they could potentially make it a little bit better. And basically, it was a big like group discussion, a round table discussion around coaching, around these ideas of EcoD, about pretty much anything was on the table. So it was unique in that front, where it's very informal. There was a loose structure to it, but there wasn't anything like an agenda you have to follow, that allowed us to kind of guide the sessions a little bit more than your typical conference, where there's a certain agenda they want to get through these exact topics. Versus like we were able to give and take in different ways, where we could present some of our ideas, and also take while other people were talking about their own ideas, or just like some of the theory, or just stuff they heard that really resonated for that day. So I think that was really cool. And in my opinion, it was one of the more impactful in-person conferences that I've actually been to, even though that was only a small portion of the actual event.
Well, good deal. So if you guys want to check out the Sport Movement Skill Conference 2023, make sure to head over to Emergent Movement, mvmt.com. I'll throw a link in the description. And also, if you want to save 7% on it, make sure to use the code EDGE7. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy today's podcast.
Let's begin. Analyzing. Finding the edge.
I think that's kind of some of the thing of, I've had to learn that, though. I think that for me is just being so tied to the ideal that you kind of don't compromise. And I think hopefully this get us started on something, because I mean, for me, that's where, even with some of the ecological dynamic stuff, like it was helpful going through what I did at Missouri State, and then just having some stuff like change on the faith side of things, and just being able to find a way to learn how to, like, you could say, submit to authority in a way, but also not give up on what you believe in, but find a way in somebody else's system how to apply an ecological approach. Because once you understand the ideas and the concepts, you can always find a way to make it to operate within an ecological approach. And so for me, it was, little things of like finding what a person was already doing and finding a way to help them with what they were already doing to have success, and like, hey, here's a way that you can do this better. Even if it was not, respected, or, if it was, what's the word? It was decoupled, they're hitting off of a T or whatever. It's like, hey, here's how we could do this a little bit better. Here's how I could make it a little bit like, manipulating constraints. And that's the thing is because constraints are always present, I can always manipulate them and help guide the athlete to be better at whatever it is that they're doing. And so I think that helped me build some trust with the athletes, so that I could be able to kind of build a relationship. But also, I think the other thing, taking a learner-centered approach, and I always said, but find what works for you. I always said that to them and gave them the freedom, so that it wasn't like, well, you have to do what I just told you to do, or rather find a way to make this work for you so that you have success.
Yeah. And I think that's the biggest thing is I think in the ecological space, like we're viewed as like, we're trying to change everything. We're just trying to blow up everything you're doing, and you're doing it wrong, and you have to do it this way. But I think as I've matured through these ideas, it is very much like, hey, we're not trying to change everything. We're trying to just make it a little better. Like, how can we potentially make this a little better? And I'll tie in one of the talks here, like Tyler Yerby's talk, I think was really practical on that front in the SMSC, because he talked about just like guiding one's search. I mean, that was the biggest thing, like asking questions. And it's like, to use a practical example, I forget exactly what he used for baseball, but it's a similar question that he asked. It's like, in a bullpen setting, we're already throwing the bullpen. and we're going to be throwing fastballs. So I could guide one search as like, hey, show me how you would strike somebody out with this fastball up in the zone. And now you're guiding one search to an area of where you could potentially throw this ball to getting out. And now you're coupling it to the actual problem at a little bit higher, even if I'm standing, even if it's just in the bullpen, but you're just making it that little bit better. And I think Tyler did a really good job of explaining that, or like, hey, show me how you could use your fastball in different ways to get inside or jam a hitter. And just simple things like that changes their intentions, which changes their search, which again, like now we're kind of starting to couple it to like a problem solution dynamic versus just like, hey, we're just doing rote repetition, fastball, 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 or something along those lines, which I think is a really good way. And again, we're not changing what we're doing. We're just making it a little better. And I think that's a simple way to do it in an ecological approach.
Yeah. I think too, on that point, the whole question of show me, I have to remember that sometimes, partially because, in my context, sometimes I've had conversations with my head coach of like, hey, we can't just let them just figure it out. Like sometimes we got to give them answers, like they come here to us, to you could say get better, or like, to have some sort of answers. It's like, okay, that's not really how, but at the same point, I was like, all right, you know what, I'll just take this and feel like I have the freedom to speed up the process, because a lot of times I was just asking questions and having them like try to answer, and they had no idea how to answer the questions that I'm asking of like, well, like for example, all right, let's begin to think of the problem of hitting. So like what dictates where the ball goes on the field, like just different, like, or like how many different ways, blah, blah, blah. And so like these things, they just had no answers for, or like, how else could you get to this inside pitch? Right. So using that as an example, because that's, you pitchers want to throw it inside and up and in. And it's like, okay, how do you get the barrel there? Show me some different ways. And they just have zero clue. So sometimes I'll be like, hey, here's one way that you could do it. And so sometimes I would give them the answer, but I wouldn't tell them that this is the only answer and that they have to do it this way. And I think for me, that's kind of how I found kind of the happy medium with that but at the same time, sometimes if I'm explaining too much, I think that's where I always have to go back to the thing that Tyler said a long time ago, is like show, don't tell, so instead of like the athlete, coming back, I'm like, hey, what happened there? And I go, what could you do next time? And they start to explain. I go, no, show me. And I think that is an important piece, because, I might have said this on a podcast once before, but like, what's the language of the body? Is it thoughts? Is it words? What language does it speak? And usually where we kind of work to is like, the body doesn't understand thoughts. It can kind of understands feelings, but really what it really, really, truly understands is movement. And so if you want to make a change, a lot of times you actually have to feel what it is that you want to do. Yeah. And so that for me is what I have to remind myself of, like, show, don't tell, especially, this whole idea and this concept of knowledge of versus knowledge about. And so if we're talking about it like we are now, we're in the realm of knowledge about. And if we want to get into how the game is played, and it's because the game is embodied, then it needs to be knowledge of. And so knowledge of is demonstrated in terms of how it actually shows up in the game. And so to me, that means that's going to be, you're going to have to move, because that's how it's expressed in the game. That's how the knowledge is expressed. So therefore, if you want to make a change, we need to actually move. And when guys do it and really fully buy in and really work at it, it's amazing how fast the changes occur. It might take a guy 5 swings to figure out an adjustment. I can, by them working on their feel reps, they can get that down to like 2 or 3. and that I think makes a huge difference when it comes to, helping guys make adjustments, and find success.
Yeah, I think to kind of circle back on some of those threads you started pulling upon, the show me thing I think is extremely powerful because it doesn't demand a verbal answer. It's asking for an actual action. It's asking for movement. So it's like when you say show me, you're not asking for them to tell you some knowledge about it. You're actually having them show you and gain knowledge of the environment. Hey, show me how you would potentially go do this. And I think the verbiage there is extremely important where I think you giving them one answer. I think, again, time scales are extremely important on that. If we don't have a ton of time, like you're headed into the season and it's February, like, and we don't have all the time in the world just to explore and have them fail and just kind of surf the landscape and try to find any possible solution. I think starting them in one spot kind of opens everything up and kind of speeds the process up. But the idea of showing you versus just having them dictate it back, I think just opens everything up. And then how you could potentially do it, I think has been something powerful for me because it kind of like opens it up. It's like, hey, I'm not telling you, I don't have the answer here. Like, I don't know how you could potentially do this. And I'm hoping you actually find an answer that I didn't even see, because then you're finding it in your own unique way and you're kind of becoming your own unique mover. And I think anybody in sport like knows if you're unique in solving problems, you probably have an advantage since the average isn't that special anymore. Like, we're looking for unique, we're looking for novel ways. Because like as a pitcher, like if I'm finding a new way to solve a problem, like it's that much harder for a hitter. If I'm doing what every other pitcher's doing, like they've seen it a million times. So like allowing them to explore and kind of like open up the landscape and just try to find their own ways, even if I have to nudge them to start, like in saying, hey, show me how you could potentially do it, I think changes everything in practice. Because it goes from like this person who's, and I think actually like I'm gonna try to pull a quote from Alex Lascu. She started her talk off and she said, I think it was from a paper, but it was like an ecologist, create conditions for athletes to exploit and flourish during development. So you're just like creating these conditions. You're not directly telling you, and that makes you the learning designer. And it's like coaches do not need to intervene or nourish the athlete. We just create these environments for them to go and explore. And then you can simply you can nudge them where they could go explore or in a way they could, and then just let them go and kind of find their solutions, which I think is so much more powerful than just being the person who just tells them exactly how to go do it. Since you're basically confining them to that one solution versus like finding their own potential way of going to do that.
I want to ask you guys a question about that. So when it comes to the show me aspect, I think it is very valuable, but I could also see in a pitching scenario how it could pull the pitcher out of the actual competition, where if you say, hey, show me how you'd get this batter out with XY pitch or set up this batter with XY pitch, do you think that leads the pitcher to sometimes focus more on kind of displaying the action for you rather than focusing on the competitive aspect of trying to beat the batter and letting that thing emerge?
Well, I guess when I'm saying show me how you would go do this, I'm trying to connect them to the batter, right? So it's like, show me how you would go get inside with your fastball. It's directly trying to connect them to potential ways to jam the hitter, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like trying to bring them actually there. So it's typically like pitchers don't live in that space. Like we're target throwers. We're not out getters typically. Like you're just throwing your best stuff as hard as you can, which if you look at Bernstein talks about that, like one of the lowest levels of skill is just doing it as fast and as hard as you possibly can. Like you're not overly, what's the term he uses? I forget exactly how he phrases it, but like you're basically showing that your skill isn't that high, since you have to go max out every single time. Like you're basically using all your energy sources, versus this idea of like, hey, let's find different ways where I can actually potentially go and get you out, where I'm not completely just emptying the tank every single time to go do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Because part of the definition of dexterity, which he he coined is it's efficient,
Yeah.
so it's, I think that's an element of, and I think that's a really good point, Baker, of, this lower level of skill of like, it's max effort. It's like, and this is kind of the thing of like, especially for pitchers, if you want to be able to be out there a long time and to pitch 3 times through the order, you can't just go and just try to pump 100 the whole game. Like, it's just not, or I don't know, 105, I guess, right? It
depends who you are. Depends who you are.
right. And I think 105 probably does have more play to it. But even 100 now, like guys can hit 100. Like that's not as to your point, novel anymore. And so, yeah, I think that's a key piece of it. It's important to be efficient, and actually, to the point of, I think it's about being intentional, exploring how can I begin to interact with to be competitive, because you can add that element in, because when you start thinking about, okay, when I'm competing, what is my goal? What's directing and shaping the movement? Like, what are my intentions? And sometimes the intentions might not be to like, how can I throw a guy inside? But if you're wanting to expand his capabilities, you may need to spend some time exploring that question. How can I do this? Can I even do this? And so to me, there's levels of, in practice, we're exploring our action capabilities, and we're trying to find the whole thing is about finding a functional fit. So how can I functionally relate to this problem, or to this task, and how many different ways can I begin to relate to this and functionally, or find, this is going back to this idea of dexterity or degeneracy, how many different ways can I solve this problem? So that when I get into situations and I start encountering different constraints, I've already explored you could say the space, the task space, so that I know, because to me, because a lot of the task space, or the what's the other space, the motor landscape. Okay, so if you think about it like a map, if you are a delivery driver, you really want to know your route and like the surrounding streets around your route and the surrounding area. The more you know it, the more, as construction or traffic or whatever shows up, the more that you're able to actually navigate around that and find different ways to still make your delivery show up on time and stuff like that. So to me, that's kind of what this analogy is, of like, during practice, we're going to explore all these different ways so that when we get into the game and, different constraints show up. I don't have a good example offhand right now, but, you have a road closure, you know how to get around that, and what are the other ways to get to the result that you want, as, let's say, for example, here is actually a good one. The umpire stops calling a certain part of the zone. Well, then, big league hitters, like, they should pick up on that, because they're all about their walks and on base and swing decisions, whatever. You should pick up on the fact that, all right, he's not calling this. I can eliminate this pitch now. And what if that's an effective pitch for the pitcher? All of a sudden, up and in is not being called. Like, it's a totally different game when the umpire's calling that up and in pitch. Then now you actually might have to swing at it. Well, now I can just eliminate that one. And so it's different things like that. Okay, what do you do if a certain pitch isn't being called? What happens today if I get a blister on my finger and I can't throw this pitch, that's really effective for me? Well, do I have other pitches that I can go to, to mitigate that? And so that to me is kind of the whole purpose of what Baker is describing, of like, hey, show me how many different ways, or how could you, throw a guy inside and make that be effective? Because it always comes back to the whole purpose of the search is to find something, to find a functional way of interacting with the problem.
Yeah, and I think that was kind of like the first, pulling on the last thing you were talking about, like one of the first things I was trying to display within my talk was the idea, like, skill acquisition versus adaptation, and what we're chasing after. Are we chasing like this fixed skill and we're just trying to acquire this fixed state where I now have this quote unquote skill and I can just plug it in anywhere, which again doesn't work if you saw my talk based on my parkour experience, or skill adaptation where we're able to adapt to the environment. Say, like you're talking about, you have that blister on the finger or the zone's changing, whatever. Do you have a solution to those, or do you not? Do you just have this one set way of going to do it, which I think is very often how what pitchers and hitters are chasing after is skill acquisition, acquiring this direct state of this is my movement that produces my best outcome or my best pitch or my best swing, versus like going out and trying to adapt to ever changing environments and trying to find solutions or having skillful interactions with the environment across all these different conditions, which again, if you think about like the best athletes, they are the most adaptable. Like you would, I think any coach would say that, like they're adjustable, adaptable, however they may say that. And like how you're setting up your learning environments and what you're exposing them to in practice. And I think the idea of like a show me how you could potentially go do something is like exactly what you're talking about, expanding that toolbox. And then we have more potential options. Like if that up and in's not there, well, I have a solution to go get outs, even though that's my best solution typically for this situation. Well, it's not there. So now what? Do I have something? Do I not have something? And I think it comes down to how you train and what your training environments actually do look like.
That's actually a really interesting, like, evaluative framework. In my mind, in my head, I have Craig Kimbrell when it was in the NLCS, and so he walked a few guys and was getting squeezed by the umpire. Ran into that conflict, and that solution he was trying to use didn't work, and then he just started throwing all fastballs. So I'm thinking about an evaluative framework of when you kind of hit adversity or one of your solutions isn't working, do you either go towards using more different solutions, or do you go like revert towards your preferred single solution? It would be interesting. Like if you look at an inning of a pitcher, there was a bad call, he's getting squeezed, the guy made an error behind him. Does that cause him to solve problems differently and more creatively, or does he kind of kick into the reversion mindset of I'm just going to go back to this one solution? His degrees of freedom of solving problems just dries up.
I think there's two elements of it, because you have to be kind of careful. And this I took this from Sean when he was working with Everson, because they spent all this time on explore. That was I think one of their themes one of the years, and then. Sean recognized, because too, Everson, I think, was in the later part of his career. And so, when you get older, especially in the NFL, like your playing time starts to, like, you have to now earn it, right? If you're in the middle of your career and you're like one of the best players, like, it's kind of like it's a lock. But so he just remembers, like, okay, during the preseason when he needs to like lock down a spot, he's watching, he's like, man, he's still out there exploring different ways to be doing things. He's like, dude, you need to go out there and just like, you need to solve this problem right now. You don't need to be trying to figure out how many different ways can you do it. And so for me, that's kind of the important piece of remembering, like, okay, we're in competition, right? You're in the NLCS. Well, right now is not the time to try something different. It's okay, based upon my past experience, what do I know works? Like we need to shut this down and we need to get out of this. And so so there's that element of it. Now on the flip side, has an athlete been trained or is attuned to be able to pick up the specifying information in the environment and be able to adjust based upon that information? That, I think, is the other element of it, that allows you, because the whole purpose of exploration is to be able to become more attuned or sensitive to the specifying information in the environment, or to information within the environment that you can use to exploit to find or to be able to have functional solutions. And so what that comes back to is like, okay, our pitchers, we're just talking about pitchers here, are they picking up on how batters are making adjustments to them? Is a hitter sitting on certain pitches? Like how is the batter reacting or responding? I want to use the word reacting. How are they swinging? Like, what are their swings telling me about, how are they getting on me? Like, is there a certain pitch actually that I should be throwing here based upon the swings that I'm getting? Like, all that sort of stuff is important pieces, in addition to like, what's the umpire calling, and what do I have a feel for? And I think that's the element that we need to help players with, is being able to pick up all the different pieces of information in the environment and know what to do with them and how to exploit that information for their benefit.
Yeah, I'm going to tie in another quote from the SMSC here. So I think this is really good. Marion Davies said, experienced learners know the meaning of the information, which I think is extremely powerful, because I think that's the difference, because it's not just you can pick up information, and we as coaches can direct attention to certain bits of information, but until they know the meaning of the information and how to act based on what they're picking up in the environment, it really doesn't mean anything. So again, like that kind of just speaks to like in these practice environments, like exposing them to these bits of information and allowing them to explore and interact with them allows them to start learning the meaning of them. Like, you can see a hitter act in a certain way based on your pitch type, but you may not know actually what that actually means. It's like, okay, he did this, and then he did that. He stepped out of the box, and then this is how he practiced his swing after that. It's okay. So what is all that telling you? How I should now go act to try to go get him out? And like, you could pick up that information. I think that's a start, but until they've experienced it and tried things based on that information and explored, okay, so this happened, I'm going to go explore here. Okay, well, that didn't work. Okay, so now I'm exposed to that same type of information. No two problems are the same, but something similar, and now I go explore it in a different way. Okay, that worked. And now you're starting to kind of learn what the information actually means to actually act upon skillfully, which I thought that quote was extremely, extremely good, because I think there's a big difference in like just picking up the information, which I think is a start, but actually like having your athletes know what that information actually means is completely different. And I've been kind of on a football kick a little bit with the Patriots struggling. Mac Jones just falling apart. I actually put a thread about it just because I've been so fascinated by the quarterback position recently. But you look at a quarterback, and all these different defenders are moving pre-snap, like they're showing different looks, but they're acting in certain ways ahead of time, and then they move post-snap, and then you being able to pick up that information and actually know what it means in lieu of what your route combos are or what your athlete's capabilities, your receiver's capabilities are, along with your capabilities of your line and so forth. And so that's what makes a good quarterback, in my opinion. And that's what I thought we potentially had in Mac Jones with the Patriots. But again, right now he's just not picking that information up at all. He's missing that bits and not acting skillfully because of that. He doesn't know the meaning of the information, or he's just not able to pick up that information at all. And I think that's a super interesting way. And in my opinion, I never hear this talked about in pitching, except for like you listen to like Greg Baddock's talk maybe. Like I've listened to him talk a couple times, and like you can tell he's really in tune with the information. But again, like how do we foster that? Like, was that something ever? Oh, that was just natural. It's okay. Well, same with some guys who throw really hard. That's natural too. But we're also teaching guys how to throw really hard. So can we teach pitchers to pick up this information, act skillfully? And I think that's the question, like I've been on the search to kind of answer, and how I could potentially answer it. I'm not saying I have the answer to that question, but I think that's something I don't think is explored within our community nearly as much.
And to kind of, I guess you could say, take that piece that you had there and twist the diamond just a little bit so you can see a different side of it. The other thing I think, with that quote, I think that quote is awesome, of like, okay, what does this information actually mean? And AJ, I think that also works well for you as an analyst, right? There's all this number, this data, like what does it actually mean? But I think to use something that Sean and Tyler talk a lot about is like, okay, where does this live and breathe? Okay, I think with information, part of the meaning, there's not just one meaning. Okay, that you have to understand where does this information actually live and breathe, and like how does it, because for example, you can understand, oh, all right, if I do this, I get this sort of result, and that's like a super superficial understanding. But if you really want to understand where it lives and breathes and all its different facets, it actually takes more. There's a higher level to understanding meaning, right? You can understand the meaning of a word, but really how to use that word and where all the places that word really works and can connect with somebody, that takes time. Just thinking about my kids, right? You give them a word and then they just start using it all over the place. And it's like, that doesn't really fit there. But that's kind of where I'm going here of like early on when somebody picks up on something, an exploit, so you could say, and it works. They just use it all the time for everything. And it's like, and then they find out, it doesn't actually work here. And then it grows. And so that's where I think that's taking it to the next level of like, what is it, getting to the deeper meaning of this whole concept of what does this information mean, I think is getting to understand all the different facets of how you can use it and utilize it and exploit it.
Did you guys watch the corresponding TED Talk that went with that quote that Marianne talked about?
I did not.
Well, to say the gist of it,
what is it, bro? What's the TED Talk?
Sorry?
What's the TED Talk? What's the TED?
It's called, where do I have it? Shoot. Oh, it's called The Reason to Be Afraid of AI.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
So the basis of the TED Talk was there was this robotics engineer, and he talked about that there was a machine learning algorithm that would essentially try to identify if a photo is either a dog or a wolf. And it was pretty good. And then at a certain point, it identified a husky as a wolf. And so then the programmers essentially probed the node of the decision tree that sent it down the way of a wolf rather than a dog. And what the algorithm was looking at as the information that specified that was the snow. And so it just so happened that all of the training data set, all the images of wolves had snow in the background. And so the computer essentially thought that snow equated to a wolf and that potentially lack of snow equated to a dog. And so when it saw the husky in the snow, it said, oh, that's a wolf. Why? Because there's snow. And I actually think that that's a really interesting support argument for rep without rep as well, where being able to have as many different representative environments prevents you from making connections with information that's not specifying. So by varying all the different ways that you can have things and having a very diverse, quote unquote, training set for the human, okay, in one circumstance, it's, my fastball got guys out here. I'm just going to always use my fastball. Well, maybe that actually won't work in all situations. So having a variety of different situations allows you to connect with the things that are actually important and can hopefully have you be more correct and accurate in choosing your solutions to the problem at hand.
And I think that's important. I think sometimes we fall into what is easiest logistically. Mm-hmm. And I think the thing that perturbs us, that allows us to actually search for a better solution, I think this is true for athletes, right? If something's really working for them, you have, in order for somebody to search for a new solution, there has to be something wrong, or they have to be encountering some difficulty that causes them to search. And so this is the whole concept of why we want challenging practices at times, that are more challenging than normal, to allow the athlete to start to search for new ways of connecting with the problem. And sometimes it's not even about making it more difficult. It's simply changing the problem, to your point, because you want to create this, some instability so that they actually have to search for a new way of connecting. And all these things, I want to say this, that, all these things are things that people have intuitively known, coaches, right? We're not saying anything that isn't known. A lot of coaches will be like, yeah, I want them to fail, so then they'll listen to me. That's a version of what I'm saying, right? Of when guys start to struggle, then they become more open to finding new ways of doing things. We're just saying that we don't think it's appropriate to try to force them down a certain path, to make them fail so that they will just do exactly what I say. But rather, when they fail, we will help them find a new and better way of solving the problem or finding success. And so to me, that's where, when people hear this, like, oh yeah, we've been doing that forever. It's like, yes, but do you understand why and how to utilize that more and more effectively? How do you stay more in that area of, to me, it's this idea of the 80-20 rule. 20% of what you do gets you 80% of the results. Okay, so what is that 20%? So we can make sure that we're doing that enough, because the way that I see it of like programs, and you could say dynasties, how they kind of, or where a program has success, they don't always know why they got the success. And then the program declines over time. And you're like, well, what happened there? And I think some of that comes back to is they lost sight of what actually made them really good. And some of it is that, what got you success in 1 year? Because everybody else, your competition is constantly adapting and evolving. So what worked 1 year might not continue to work the more you do it over time, because of the fact other people, other programs are starting to do other things that maybe either counter it or are using the same things now. And so that advantage that you had begins to disappear. And so if you don't know how to iterate it in a way that gets you more of the stuff that you're doing that is good, then eventually everybody else catches up and you kind of start to go on the decline. And so to me, that's the whole point of why, okay, yeah, you're hearing like, oh yeah, we've done that. Like, that sounds like something that we've already done. It's like, good, do more of it. Here's more ways of building it out and thinking about it so that you can continue to have success and maintain your edge over your competition.
Yeah, I'm gonna pull on two things here. One is I've heard that argument a lot for the ecological framework. It's like, oh, good coaches have been doing that for years. It's like, okay, well, if good coaches have been doing that for years, oh yeah, we do a version of that already. Well, if you already do it, and so you already believe in it somewhat, and if good coaches have been doing that for years, and you're calling them good coaches, usually they call them great coaches, but we're giving you basically a framework for how some of the greatest coaches have been doing it. Maybe they didn't have this framework, but they kind of intuitively knew it. And now we kind of have this framework of how these coaches have potentially put this together, but an actual theory behind it and how you could potentially build it out. So like that argument I always hated. I was like, this is actually like, you're actually telling me there's a ton of value in what I'm saying and how we could potentially go build it out now that we have a theory showing you why this stuff worked when great coaches deployed it, right? So I think that for one, I think is always interesting. And two, I think there's another talk I want to pull from in the SMSC from Keith Davids. He talked a lot about this idea of innovation creativity, and he talked about the intelligent performer. And the idea of the intelligent performer, and every coach wants an intelligent performer because this is somebody, and he says it can solve problems by the use of information, and they show creativity and innovation. And he talked a lot about this idea encourages a ton of rep without rep and kind of exploring the perception action couplings. But I think one thing when I was reading up on Bernstein's paper, he talks about the biggest piece or the last piece, and he thinks the most important piece of dexterity is resourcefulness. And this idea of quick-wittedness or intuitiveness. And like those two things, I think right there is where you start seeing this person who can solve all these different problems, but they always are quick-witted, even when they're exposed to something new. And they always have this intuition about how to potentially go change how they're doing something. And that could be a coach too, like how they change their program. Like they have all these success all these years. Well, they know how to continually to adapt and change, and they're super resourceful with how they go about and behave. And that's no different with an actual athlete. And I think it's really interesting because Bernstein always talk about dexterity is the highest level, right? Like everybody wants a dexterous mover. Well, a piece of that is this idea of resourcefulness. And it's like, again, like, are you just born with that, or can we continue to kind of foster that quick-wittedness and this intuitiveness within the athletes so they can continually kind of solve these problems by the use of the information and continually kind of adapt to it. And like the whole idea, again, what Bernstein's talking about is like, it's not repeating the means of just the movement, but solving the problem over and over. And that's the rep without rep, which what we're kind of talking about, which I think that's key. And I've kind of been sitting on that for a while. It's like, okay, so how do we kind of help our athletes become more resourceful? And even like me as a coach, how do I become more resourceful and actually have that kind of, when I see something in the environment, how do I continually challenge myself to be able to be a little more quick-witted and to be able to kind of maneuver the landscape or change the learning environment or manipulate these constraints in different ways to have the athlete or meet the athlete at their actual challenge point a little more consistently, or just manipulate the information they're interacting with, right? And I think that therein lies the highest level of skill. But again, like something I don't hear talked about a ton, but something I've been kind of ruminating on. But like this whole idea, and I think where the SMSC is kind of like this idea of art and science, and like the art piece of this whole thing is like you see these athletes, and like I think everybody would say the best athletes are most creative. They have these creative ways of getting out of situations, or they come up with a move you've never seen before. But like that's the art being displayed on field with these theoretical backing, which is maybe a little more of the scientific piece of it. But like the art displayed is only shown, I think, if they're allowed to explore, be exposed to this rep without rep, and not put inside these silos or these boxes that they have to perform within, or they're kind of stuck within these. Because you'll never see a resourceful athlete if you're telling them what to do or how to do it or giving them the solution.
I agree. I guess I want to kind of throw this over to AJ a little bit more. I want to get him talking a little bit more. I mean, the other thing too, I should mention, like, this is I really like, Sean does a really good job coming up with, I'm assuming it's Sean, coming up with the themes for the Sport Movement Skill Conference. And I think this is kind of the thing, because I've also heard people knock like, it's just a theory. There's no, when it comes to like the computational or the I think it's computational ways of thinking about or computational theories of, or information processing theories of, how the brain works, all this sort of stuff. There's all this more science behind this and versus that. And I think people don't take for granted that, well, there's an art to this as well. Like, and I think people are too wrapped up in the academic stuff of like, I'll only believe it if there's science behind it. Not that there isn't science behind this stuff too, but it just, I find that a little bit frustrating in the sense that when you start getting down to like, okay, how do I actually help an athlete? To me, this is where, just from experience, this seems to make more sense. Like, an athlete seems to have more success, transferable success. And the last piece, I guess I wanted to loop this in before. What I have seen where an athlete has the most success is when, I kind of help guide their search a little bit, but then I let them go. Like, I might help, educate their attention here, or help them, with their intention or whatever. And then I step back and I let them just like kind of figure out like, okay, what do they actually want to work on? We give them space to explore. And then I just sit there and I observe, what are they doing? How are they trying to interact with the problem? And then I come back in, like I said before, of like, okay, what are they currently doing? How do I help them to the next step for them to be successful? And then I come in and I leave, and we just have this, because a lot of times guys they might go off on like following some guy on the internet who is really focused on some sort of mechanical cue. And I don't think I'm ever going to be able to prevent a guy from going that, if they're inclined that direction and they want to go that direction. I think you have to let a guy go explore where they want to go explore. But then for me, it's about helping them reintegrate that back into them being successful. And I've had that conversation with one of our hitters of, he's really down the teacher man rabbit hole. And like, now half the team, like, I'm watching them like coil and do one-legged stuff and whatever. And it's fine because there's some value there. So it's like, hey, let them find the value and how it works to them. But then I've come back and I've told them, like, to the guys that start to struggle with some of it, is like, hey man, where's your focus? You're so wrapped up in coiling over your back hip and making sure this or whatever. Like, like I asked one, I was like, do you feel free, or do you feel like you're constrained, you're chained, or do you feel not free? And it's like, yeah, I don't feel free. It's like, hey man, like you need to like allow yourself to focus on, like, because we had this conversation, well, actually a long time ago. I tried to step in and try to like tell him, like, hey man, if like you're not having success, like what's the definition of stupidity? Trying the same thing over and over again. And, and then it didn't land with him. But because he just remembered being like telling me, no, like the whole reason I'm like chasing this thing right now is this worked really well for me in the summer. And it's like, I felt so calm. And I was thinking about it later. I was like, oh, that's it right there. That calm feeling. And so like, anyways, I looped that back in. I was like, hey man, like you told me before, like you felt super calm. Like, do you feel calm now when you're just focused on this back hip? And it was like, no. It's like, hey man, like this, maybe, like I told him, hey, you need to understand there's this ideal space. You need to understand where you are right now and how you're relating to it. And so, it's how you need to figure out when it comes to, other people's stuff, like the back hip or whatever. When is it that you need to focus on that? And when is it that you need to just be fully present in the moment and focus on just hitting the ball and just being free? And then knowing when to grab that thing and to use it and to be successful. And like, that's the thing that's, going back to what you were saying, Baker, of like the meaning, like, when does this matter? When do you need to bring this in and focus on it? Because from my own personal experience, I actually have to use mechanical cues of like, I'm getting too tilted this way. So I actually need to get my back hip more. I need to actually let my front hip, and that helps get my ball up. Doing this whole thing of like, I'm just focused on staying connected, whatever, and blah, blah, blah. Like, I didn't get enough success, but I found I would get moments of success for that next pitch that would get me back to, I didn't need to focus on it. I just need to focus on, like my arm needs to go through this window or whatever it is. Like, I now know, like, what are my little mechanical things that I need to go to make the adjustment. But I found if I keep focusing on them, the effectiveness goes away. And so I was kind of trying to help him understand, where do these things that you pick up on the internet, like how do you actually incorporate them into your toolbox, and how to be able to effectively pull those things out. And so anyways, to me, that's kind of the thing of like, coaches, get all hung up on like, oh, this guy is wrecking him, whatever, cause he's all focused on mechanical, whatever. But if this is what a guy is interested in, like, I just need to help them figure out how to integrate this back. And on my long rant, to try to tie it all the way back, what I tend to find is that they will naturally begin to interact with the stuff that I was talking about when I give them the space and the freedom, and they go on their own way and they explore this other thing. They'll eventually, over time, like come back and explore that, and they'll be like, oh, this is how it works. But it has to come in its own timing. You can't force the timing of when what you brought to them, when it comes and it finds its full fruition, And so that for me is the thing that I think is important, is giving guys space to where you just step back and you let them explore and kind of do their own thing and like kind of figure it out on their own.
Yeah, I think there's actually something really profound in there, and it relates back to what Baker talked about, of having the dexterity as a coach as well. In my mind, it's kind of a fallacy to think, oh, we don't want our players to plug and play solutions. Like, we have one technique that we apply to all problems. And if you flip it on the same way, it also shouldn't be the same with a coach. There shouldn't be one way of coaching or going about things that you apply to every single athlete. And personally, that's very convicting to me, to be able to have that open mind and being able to experiment. If we want our athletes to be creative and experiment within practice, we also need to have the grace to be able to experiment with our own style of coaching and developing practice as well. And that's something where, going back to kind of the art and science aspect of the conference, if you think about art and science, they're both experimentation. they both kind of are experimenting different ways that I can use in art, say whether it's painting, different ways I can use colors to generate some sort of image. In science, it's what different ways can these variables interact together that we can kind of find something kind of beautiful through it. And I think that core of the experimentation, keeping the open mind, and okay, I have all of these constraints and tools and abilities at my disposal. How can I potentially shift those in different situations? And I think from a coaching standpoint, if we're asking our athletes to do that, it kind of needs to also fall back on us for us to keep that same sort of mindset and be able to apply that in our coaching as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm going to play off of the idea of the art and science, because it kind of sprung a thought in my mind that actually came off of Bernstein's paper. It's just the idea of like a really good artist, if he's doing a painting and he accidentally drops a glob of paint somewhere on his painting, like, is that painting done? Or with really good artists, he's able to see what now it just got created because of that mistake and create something completely different, but potentially even better because of his ability to be a little more resourceful, quick-witted, and act a little bit more like what you would, of course, say is a little more dexterous within his time. And I think that's the same with within any kind of athlete or with any kind of coach. It's this idea of like you have some kind of mistake or there was a mess up or something, like how quickly can you go correct this, and based on the new information that's within the environment. And I think that's really interesting. And I think again, I'm going to tie another talk in here on the SMSC, but Jim Haverstrom, I think, did a really cool job.
Yes.
I loved his talk. It talked about the technique takes care of itself. But one of the first things he talked about was being a musician for a bunch of years. Like he was a professional musician, trumpet player. And I wrote this quote down, and he said he got to a point where he was the best trumpet player when he said he was not worried about playing the trumpet, just playing music, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. It's this idea of like, he wasn't no longer like focused on all the techniques and all these perfect ways he has to play the trumpet. He was just trying to play the music. And I think therein lies, again, Garrett, some of what you're talking about. Like the person who's so focused on their technique and how they have to move this way or that way, they're so worried about just swinging versus just playing baseball. And I think that's a massive difference. And like when you can get the person, again, like what he talks about, have the technique take care of itself. Again, Garrett, I think to your point, I think there is time where like playing with different kind of mechanical quote unquote cues or whatever could have some potential value for that person, but at a certain point, like that, you're going to self-organize in your best solution. Are you adding action capabilities or effectivities in ways you could potentially move by practicing some of that? Sure. But then once you're back into it and you're just playing baseball, like the technique may potentially take care of itself in a better way. And he kind of talks about, and I would highly suggest anybody who hasn't gotten the conference, like even if it's just like for a couple of these talks I brought up, this is one great one because he talks about his journey as a coach. And like how he was talking about these perfect techniques, like even just like, hey, this is exactly how you have to bend your knees. And then you're seeing all these different kind of ways of people bending the knees. And then he added some different constraints, like jumping over something and how they landed. Okay, so the technique kind of took care of itself. That's exactly where I want you kind of to be, but it's because you landed and then you were there. Or then he started using different analogies. He talked about Nick Wugelman's book. And like he was getting so frustrated with their athletes not being able to do what he wanted to do, and then changed it to this different kind of game and kind of was a little more quick-witted. It's like, hey, these young kids love cutting people in line, and watch what they do on skates when they cut them in line. It's like, okay, so like let's have them try to cut people in line while they're trying to gain an advantage, trying to go, I forget what he calls it.
Because they're
create angles.
Yeah.
He called it creating angles. And it's like, if I'm trying to get him to create angles, if I tell him just to cut the guy in line as he's skating, like I'm going to see it. And then what emerged is the technique he was looking for. And I thought that was a really cool way, and kind of how he talked about his journey and like how he was frustrated with the verbal cues he was using trying to get this. And then he was like, well, this isn't working, obviously. And then just seeing he was open to what is within the environment. Hey, like cutting's kind of emerging what I want to see. Let's use that and see if that kind of gets it. And it did, which is really cool.
Too, I want to plug for anybody now who's listening. SMSC 23, you guys should check it out. Hopefully this gives you like some ideas of which talks. I mean, we should have if I had done this, opened this the way that I should have, of like an actual podcast episode. I would have put this in here of like, started us with, hey, what were your favorite speakers? Because I think some of it is for people like, knowing, like, you might not know all the names, like, oh, who's Jim? What was his last name? I can't. It starts with an H.
I think it's Haverstrom. I could be saying it wrong.
Haverstrom. Yeah. Like who's that? I've never heard of him, right? But like once you begin to see like, oh, hey, we're finding a ton of value. Like, hey, this is a talk that you want to go listen to. So you guys should pick this up. And if you want a discount on it, use Edge 7 to get a 7% off. Okay. So if you're wanting to save a little bit of money too and get this, or if you want to pay full price and support Emergence, by all means, don't use it. So with that being said, yeah, what were some of your guys' favorite talks that you guys pulled a lot of good info on? It's slightly, I'm getting off topic here. I'm going to back up just a second to go off of what you were just saying, Baker. That's exactly, I just listened to that talk with Jim. Mm-hmm. When this guy was getting all domed up on his rear hip coil. And so I was, like, that's where I would say for people, that talk for sure you need to listen to, because it was really helpful for me to be able to connect with one of my players and really help him. Just kind of like, he had a kind of an aha moment. And it was just fun to watch him go back in there and like he's mishitting balls, all this sort of stuff, and like our machine, we have a poor man's version of an eye pitch, and because all our balls are at different states of quality, so there are sometimes it'll throw you a good fastball, and other times it'll throw you a splitter, changeup, whatever. And it was fun to watch him be able to now all of a sudden adjust to those off-speed pitches and hit them. So he was hitting the fastball and he's being able to adjust it to the off-speed pitches that it was throwing. And that's where it's like, yeah, man. Because this is the thing, the other thing too. For me, when it comes to this stuff, I know there is a process where like, yeah, your performance might dip a little bit. But in my opinion, when you get it right and the athlete's able to connect with the environment, it clicks. It's not this whole like, hey, you're going to suck for a long time. Like what we're trying to do when I'm trying to guide your search, I'm trying to guide you to a place where you have this functional fit. When we find the functional fit, it clicks. It's not this whole like suck for a while and then get better. It's I'm trying to help you better relate with the environment. And so when we find the thing, we should see success. We should start to see, we should start trending towards success. Maybe we don't see success right away, but we start trending in that direction. And so to me, that's where I think, some folks, in order to get a player to buy in will say, oh, you need to suck, you're going to suck or whatever. It's like, I dislike the underlying implications or insinuations there. I think, no, if I'm going to give you something, you should find success. I like this thing that Donnie Ecker said, try this. And it doesn't work out. It's like, yeah, let's pretend that never happened. We'll never do that again. I think there's something to that of like, what I give you should help you work towards success. And sometimes, yes, it's true. I give it, it's actually the inappropriate time, but sometimes you do just have to introduce it and you just kind of walk away and you just kind of like revisit it. And it does take time. It does have that. So I don't fully hate it, but I don't think we should lean on that too much. Anyways, to the other question of like, what were some of your guys' favorite talks?
Bake, go ahead.
There's a ton of ones I really, really enjoy. Obviously, the Haverstroms, I've already shouted out. I've shouted out a few of them. And I think it really depends what you're interested in, right? Because I think a lot of them took different ways. But I would be remiss if I didn't bring up Keith Davids. I think Keith Davids, again, like he's a little heavy in theory at times. So if you're a little more experienced with the ideas, like Keith Davids is a no-brainer. Even if you're not, just to get exposed to them, I thought he did a really good job, and it may be something you have to listen to if you're not familiar with these ideas a few times. But that's how I kind of started learning these ideas. Like I had to listen to things over and over and over, like some of these type talks. And then I started kind of like, oh, I see that. Oh, I'm starting to understand that. So I think his was really good. Tyler Yerby's was super practical. I think anybody can grab something from that super quickly. And again, I already brought him up. Again, Sean runs the whole thing. So I think
his talk I thought was good too.
Yeah, he talked through his paper, and there's a lot of theory in there. But I like that, one, you can go back to the paper, and two, like, it is really practical at the same time. Like, he did a really good job of still making it practical.
Even if you don't understand any of the words, like his whole talk was like being at one, or being one with the environment. Like you don't need to understand technical terms to understand that concept of being one with the environment.
Yeah, for sure. I just know when I started, I would get lost. Like, they would start bringing up terms I wasn't familiar with, or like when you start talking about system degrees of freedom, I didn't know what the heck that meant, right? So it's like just being aware that there may be some concepts you may have to wrestle with a little bit, or re-listen to, or go read the paper afterwards, and that's how you're going to grow. I just wanted to at least throw that out.
What was that Bernstein paper, by the way, that you keep referencing?
Oh, just dexterity and development. Is his classic dexterity and development. Like, I found a PDF version of it. I think baseball wise, like Rob Gray, obviously, like, I think most people who listen to this are baseball people. So I think Rob Gray's a no brainer. Like, go listen to Rob Gray's. I'm not going to say listen to mine, so that'd be prideful, but I was the only other baseball talk on there. So feel free. But I also talk about parkour a healthy bit. So if you're also into parkour, like, then definitely listen to it. But I'll stop there because I'll let AJ hop in there if there's any that spoke to you.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't need to do the pridefulness yourself. I was going to pitch yours. Obviously, I was kind of there when you were going through it and working through the ideas, and it was awesome kind of being able to connect baseball to parkour and be able to talk about the synergies that exist in between was pretty awesome. Something that really jumped out at me was Tom Pari's one. I know that one was maybe kind of got buried in there on day one, but something I'm really fascinated with recently is kind of how these different constraints of kind of the stories about how people view themselves impact the way that they play. And that kind of ties in a little bit into Kirsten Wings and Chris McCosker's as well. But kind of talking about, well, like, what is the national culture you're a part of? What's the soccer culture you're a part of in Tom Pari's example? What are those different cultures, and how does that kind of shape the way you play the game? I know, Baker, you'll know with a lot of the guys on the Mets where there's a lot of Hispanic players, and that really shapes the way that they play. A lot of their upbringing kind of shapes their attitude and the solutions that they find on the field. And I'm really fascinated about how we can learn more about that and be able to help them understand how that context fits into the problem solver they are as an athlete. So that was something that has been really fascinating to me recently. And I know that's less of the activity-based setting up practice type of things. That's more pre-work stuff, but I find that incredibly fascinating of how that drives the practice design, and also just how you relate to your athlete and how it helps you put yourself in their shoes to understand why they're going about different solutions in different ways. So that was a big one for me. And then honestly, anything that kind of opened up different portals that Stu McMillan talked about, things that were different or that I hadn't seen before and kind of sent me down different rabbit holes was huge. Stu obviously had a few of those. Austin Jochum had a bunch of those, but just something that kind of pops up in the environment, so to speak, that you can pick up on and say, oh man, I never thought about it in that way. How can I maybe do a little bit more research on this on my own to be able to integrate it into how I view the world and kind of what my framework is? Where does this fit? I think those were things that really got me excited, was kind of open up the affordances for me to pursue by myself as well.
Yes, Stu's was great. And so same with Jochum's. I think S&C, like, for sure, go listen to Jochum's. I thought he did a really good job of kind of like his old way of thinking, which I think is the most traditional way of thinking, versus how he's viewing the world now. I thought that was really good. And yeah, Stu, I don't think I've ever heard Stu talk and him not crush it. And there were some quotes in there that like I use almost daily nowadays because it's so powerful. But yeah, I mean, I hate to say it, but like, as I've listened to the talks like maybe 2 or 3 times, certain ones, and as I go back through it, I'm like, oh, I really like this one. Oh, I didn't pick up anything from this one, but now I actually picked up a lot from stuff like that. So I would say, I mean, you could start anywhere, honestly, and you're probably going to get good stuff. Anything we've mentioned, I think, like, naturally, like, spoke to us. a little bit, but I even think like I'll shout out Andrew Wilson too. He was on this podcast already. Like his was an incredible talking about the role of science within sport and how like they are actually could be partnering with us versus like us as practitioners or coaches. Like we see almost ourselves as odd. Like what the heck do they know, right? We kind of talked about like how they could actually be impactful, and then some of the examples later, like so practical, like his doors example. Like I'll leave it there. I mean, we could talk about it, but like I would highly suggest going to listen to that just for that example. So I think that will connect with people like right away. I think that was a super practical example. But yeah, there's so many good talks, honestly. And I would always suggest like listening to them multiple times, because I've listened to a couple, 3 or 4 times, and I realized that my section for notes on that talk wasn't big enough. And I'm like in the margins now, and there's stuff that didn't speak to me the first time, spoke to me the second time or third time, which is always really cool.
The other one that I think we haven't mentioned yet, and I I just listened to this one yesterday and I really liked it, was Ben Franks. Ben Franks is always good, but like his stuff was more relevant, I think, to because it's baseball adjacent. He was talking about cricket and cricket batters, and I was like, well, so if you're, I mean, this has been pitching heavy, but if you're into hitting, Ben Franks's talk I thought was really, really good and interesting. And you know, when he was talking about specifying information, because this is some of the stuff I think you have to me, this is kind of in part the art and the science, right? There's the because this is where also too I like Ben's talk. You know, he is talking about, you know, he's not such a hardcore idealist when it comes to EcoD anymore. You know, he's like, I got away from that a little bit. You know, part of it helped, he said, getting off Twitter and, you know, stop getting in those Twitter spats. And I think for me, that's where it is, you do have to get there, because for me, the Q part of like focusing on my back hip, whatever, I was like, this isn't ecological. And it's like, but it works. So I to me, this is the art and the science of understanding. To me, ecological dynamics gives me a framework to understand where to put, like, where things live and breathe. And so like each of these things has a place that it fits ecologically. So for example, you know, I'm talking about these cues. I understand, because of the ecological approach, that I really need to be focused on my connection to the problem in the environment. And it needs to be, you could say, for lack of a better word, for people who are a little bit more familiar with this, external. But it's interesting, and I don't know, you know, maybe it has to do with the different streams of the brain, but you can hold two things kind of in tension, you know. So for example, when I'm throwing BP or whatever, I still am going to be connected to my target and focus on that, but I might focus on my hip a little bit more. So it's actually kind of like it's kind of split in two, but I keep one more primary. I have to remember that my primary focus has to stay external. And this is just a point that I have to, you know, feel and kind of focus on it. But then after I do it once or twice or whatever, I can start to let that go, and I can start to focus more and be even more external. Because to me, from an ecological perspective, it's all about our relationship and how are we relating to the environment, to the problem. Part of that relationship involves like, okay, how am I relating to myself? How is my body right now relating to the problem, or how am I relating to my body and to the problem? And so sometimes I have to, you know, interact with my body to help it connect and relate to the problem better. But it's not, because the old school way of thinking, I used to think this way, is if I just got my mechanics perfect, the results would take care of themselves. And it turns out that while that is true sometimes, the system itself will not, you could say, you know, because of entropy, you know, it tends to move towards disorder. So even if you can get it into that spot of like that per se, and it feels like that, I don't think that's really what's going on. I think the system gets attuned and calibrated. And so you have that attunement that's going on. Your nervous system is highly sensitive to everything that's going on. And it gives you that feel of, you know, my mechanics had just set it. But there's some element of truth to that too anyways, because, you know, there are higher order variables that we attune to. And if you can figure out these higher order principles, everything becomes more simple. And I think that's that's the other element of this, of how this all starts to pull and come together, is actually when you become more of a master, things actually get more simple, because the information basically specifies what to do, and you have like these principles, and you know how to properly order things. So what I mean by that is, I know that being external is the higher principle, and so this internal focus of attention actually sits down here. So I don't get hyper focused on it. I just know when to bring this in to help me connect better with my external environment, and then I can let it go. And I know that this is the primary thing. And so when you can begin to understand what are the bigger principles, everything becomes a lot more easy. I think of it, and I'll analogize it with this, is I used to think that, this hopefully is not a knock on Cressy, but like, you needed to have a program, right? If you didn't have the program written out and handed to a guy, you're letting a guy down. And that was like, if it's just in a guy's head, that's like super lowbrow and whatever. But then you begin to find out, like Louis Simmons, some of the best strength coaches, literally had nothing written down. And you just come to them, they would be watching the sets, whatever, and they'd tell you exactly what the next thing you're supposed to do. What I realized is that's actually the highest level of coaching, is they are adapting what they're doing on the fly. They know from experience and from like their understanding, all of it, they're pulling it all together to know in that moment exactly what to give a guy. And so that to me is where you're trying to get to with all this stuff of like that adaptability of like, okay, something slightly shifted, no problem, because I understand conceptually in my framework of like how all these things play together and what's actually the most important thing and how to get me to that place. Last analogy here. Lord of the Rings. This is one of my favorite books. I remember the story of the Mines of Moria. Okay. Gandalf takes the fellowship into the mines. He doesn't have a perfect map and know where how to navigate through this exactly. But instead, Tolkien talks about, he knew what direction he wanted to go. And so he steered the fellowship based upon his understanding of like where we need to go and kind of like through the feel and kind of his old memories of it. And so to me, that's kind of the thing of like, I might not know exactly where I'm going, but I have an idea of where north is. I'm steering myself towards that true north. And so to me, that's kind of how this to me kind of works, is like, I have that goal and I know, and I'm trying to figure out, okay, where am my relationship to that goal? And as long as I'm working towards it, even if I'm ending up going, I know I need to go up, but I'm going up this way, well, I'm slightly moving closer. So as long as I'm moving closer, even if it's not exactly linear, I'm still making progress towards that thing. And so to me, that's kind of the how I look at like the ecological approach and this whole notion of like nonlinearity and how all these things play together to help me get to my intended goal of the performer being able to be successful in any given situation. So to me, it's like, if you can define what it is that you're trying to do, everything else begins to organize itself around that thing. And so you have to figure out what's that highest thing that's going to give you a lot of all the other things. And it's kind of this whole notion of constrained to afford. Anyways, that's my long rant.
Yeah, I think. Oh, go ahead, Big. Go ahead.
No, you got it.
No, I was gonna say, I think something that really jumped out at me in there is that, being open to kind of where different things come from. I know that was kind of a little bit earlier, and then you kind of work towards how does that all fit in the framework. But I think that's really important. Where, like Baker said, he was able to take something different and something new from every presentation. And even in presentations where he originally was like, I'm not really connecting with anything, but going back through it did. And I think that's really important, is whether it's something that, exists in the way of your way of viewing the world, whether it's in the ecological dynamics framework or not, there is some sort of kernel of value in there somewhere that can relate into your own framework in a way. And so it's kind of figuring, okay, how can I keep an empty enough of a cup to allow for those things that at first might not seem like it's something I agree with or something that it fits into my way of being? How can I see, is there any kernel of this that can fit into the framework that I can use to be able to orient towards the goal of achieving something. You know, some people might think that there's one way to do something and someone else has another way, but they're all trying to achieve the same thing. It's just a different way of going about it. And so how can you create your own unique framework of orienting toward that North Star goal?
Yeah, and I think as a lot of speaks, you never step in the same river twice. I think that's a lot of what goes on when somebody like me goes back and listens to a talk. Like my recent experiences, what I've been looking into, what else I've been reading on the side, just how my life has been playing out, all that kind of stuff is now shaping how I'm interacting with these talks a little bit different every single time. And things are speaking to me differently, or the same things speaking to me in a different way than it was previously, which I think is extremely important, because that it can easily tie into like the performer environment relationship where you're just going to practice. Like the same problem may speak to an athlete completely differently based on what he's been doing or who he is that day. Because I think that's super interesting when you can view yourself. And I think this is something I've been trying to do a little more myself as kind of that learner. And as I'm going through things and as I go through a journey, even like me trying to learn Spanish this off season, like me going through those experiences and learning like the app I'm working through actually challenged me a little rep without rep. And things are starting to click a little more because like I'm challenged to use phrases or words in new contexts. Like I just don't learn a phrase and then we move on. Like I learn a phrase and then I have to say it in a different context and a different conversation later on in the same lesson, which is helping me. And then I get stuck and I was like, oh, I'm not adaptable with that yet. Like I acquired that phrase for that exact one situation, but I haven't actually gained skill yet with that phrase because now I can't go use it in all these situations. Like it's actually not a usable phrase for me. And just being able to connect that again, like I talked about that a little bit in my talk when I learned that through parkour. It's like, oh, I learned this move. And like, yeah, this thing's the same height, but the environment's so differently that it's speaking to me in such a different way that I can't even go perform it anymore. Or maybe that it looks the exact same, but like I'm going to do something different since who I am that day is a little bit different. But I think that kind of sparked that idea for me. And like, I think that's really important for coaches as you kind of just view anything. Like you go listen to a podcast you've listened to before, you're going to pull something differently than you did the first time, which I think is really cool. So it's like you could literally, it's same with reading books. Like you could read all these different books and change books every single time, but you could literally go back to the same book you read 2 years ago and you are going to pick up so many different things than you didn't pick up the first time, or you're going to read the same thing and it's going to speak to you so differently.
I think too, or it's going to remind you, because I know there's sometimes it's like, oh man, I forgot about this. Like,
very true.
Why did I get away from this? And it just, yeah. So good points. AJ.
Muy bueno, Senor Baker.
Gracias.
So, I don't know if you guys want to wrap there, but I also wanted to see, like, are there any other things though before potentially wrap it up of that you wanted to talk about, like things like concepts, whatever that came up in the talk that either you wanted to flesh out more or you didn't understand? I guess that's kind of what I at least wanted to see from you guys.
Yeah, I mean, personally, there were two things that kind of jumped out in the tickler file that I want to talk with you guys. Thinking one's kind of more procedural and one's kind of more about practice design. I guess we can start with the practice design first. But the question that's been taking up resonance in my mind recently is, do we have enough opposition in our practices? Like I think about baseball and everything you do, there is always an opponent. There's always opposition. And if you look at a time breakdown of how we spend our practices, the time spent with an opponent there is very minimal. Like I look back to my own playing days and I would go dominate bullpens, but then as soon as I get out into the game, I would really struggle because there's an alive human being in the box doing things that I did not expect that was going to happen in the bullpen. And obviously we can simulate different intentions that Baker talked about in bullpens, but it nowhere comes close to having the same sort of opposition. I think baseball is definitely behind in that area, and I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts and ways that we could potentially integrate that more into practice.
I mean, I think it's simple. I mean, I don't know if we've talked about it, Baker, but like, I'm 100% with you. The thing that I want to more start with is like, why is it the way it is? And I think we we already have enough success doing what we're doing that there's no reason to, right? Because nobody else is doing it. Like, why? Also, logistically, it's harder. Like, I have in my mind exactly how I'd want to do it, but you have to integrate. You have to integrate your offense and defense together. Like, going back to, eventually I'll directly answer your question, but going back to, things that successful coaches have done in the past, they scrimmage, right? Like, a lot of their fall ball was just scrimmages and like, they got way better. Well, why is it? Because, are they just playing the game? Yeah, sure. I mean, there's ways to, again, the ecological approach helps you to we're not just playing the game. Like, all of a sudden, for example, okay, let's use a scrimmage as an example. Okay. And to me, this is the highest level, right? All right, we're scrimmaging. Now we're going to create different slices. Okay, we're going to create different scenarios. We're going to just start throwing in different game scenarios. This is the thing of, yes, random is fine. That, like, all of a sudden you have some random dude just run through the middle of the field during your scrimmage. Okay, all right, something, or you throw a physio ball on the field and like smack a guy. Okay, while he's doing something like completely crazy off the wall. You can do that, and there might be some small marginal benefit there to help guys find better solutions. But eventually, because this is the whole thing, I was talking to another coach, and maybe I'll release this podcast at some point. Bobby Tewksbury is on. And he's like, look, the game is not completely random. Everybody talks about this randomness, and I'm totally with him on this of like, yeah, you're right. The game is not completely random. There's not just like, again, you're not going to just have like a physio ball just like fly in and hit a guy in the middle of the game. That's not going to happen. All of a sudden the ball's not going to fall straight down from the sky and he's going to have to like a Mauer quick swing and like hit a ball. Like, that's not, those types of things are not going to show up in the game. So the game is predictable. There is some predictability to the game. Otherwise you need the proper constraints. Constraints actually create predictability. If you didn't have the constraints, you wouldn't be able to play the game because it's too, like, if the umpire just started changing the zone a ton, right? That's why like guys get pissed off, is because it's like, well, that wasn't a strike, an inning or two ago. All of a sudden the zone just completely changed, and it's like changing, like the game would not cease to function, right? So because of that, we actually have to constrain things to the point that you do get some level of consistency, but it's about the variation. And so anyways, this is where I'm going with this of on that long side rant. We can create slices of the game. Okay. And so we can have guys do different passes through certain areas of the game more frequently if that's what they need to work on. Okay. And so this intervention, this whole thing of like, oh, we just sit back and we don't do anything. No, we can come in and we can intervene and change what's going on. Maybe do more stuff with 2 outs, runners in scoring position, etc., higher pressure stuff, right? All stuff that people have known before, but these are the things that you can do more of. I think that's my point. Okay, so this is the highest level. Baker, do you want to throw anything else in there before I get into like specifically answering his question of like, okay, because to me, it's all about logistics. When we get down to this of like, why is it that people do what they do the way they do it now versus what we're talking about, I think comes back to logistics. It's all about logistics.
I'll hop on the backside. I'll let you finish your rant here.
Well, because so to me, as you're going to your question of like, okay, how do we integrate this more? You already were starting to say it like, okay, put a batter in there. Like now we need to like have a batter and throwing to batters. Like, to me, this is like, duh, right? That's step one. But if you want to scale it up, okay, how do we make it more game-like? For both, this is true for both the hitter and the pitcher. You need an umpire. But the umpire now needs to become, the coach needs to not call the zone a perfect zone. He needs to not do that. You actually have to be intentional, I think, at the highest levels of you need to change the zone, whether it's within session or session to session. It can't be like, and that's hard. Having tried to do it, it is hard. It's hard to do, and you need to be disciplined. because you're going to fall back to your preferred zone. And you have to be intentional and set the intention of, okay, this is the zone that I'm going to call today. And sometimes you do have to get in there and feel it out of like, where are guys, where, like, kind of feel the room and get to read the room and figure out like, okay, what type of zone actually needs to get called today, and like, how do I want it? But you do have to maintain awareness of what that zone is. And that is, I think, for, a lot of people that's going to be difficult. Some people who are like really type A and on top of it, I don't think they won't struggle with this, but I do think from observation of just trying to implement this stuff and using it as it's the specific example of calling a zone. I've tried to do things ecologically, and eventually you just fall back to certain things, and then it becomes all the same. Like I find that happening a lot of like, all right, I want something that has all this cool variability rep without rep, but we just hit off the machine a lot, and we fall back to these certain things. And so this is why I'm saying, like, you have to be very, very intentional if you want to have things, if you want to be able to explore things, and you have to be kind of paying attention. And it's a lot of work because it's all about logistics in my mind. And that's what's going to play into what you can do is like, okay, if your system is not set up for your pitchers to throw to hitters consistently, guys aren't built up, your pitchers aren't built up to handle that workload, you can't do it. Like that I think is a big prerequisite of you need to have pitchers who are conditioned and their arms can handle it to be able to throw at the level that they're able to interact. Because it's a question of like, like basic things of like number of repetitions, like how many passes or opportunities are you going to get at this thing? And we begin to break it down, like the number of opportunities, the way the current system is set up for pitchers is incredibly low. Once a week, for 25 pitches, how many, like, that's what, maybe 3 batters? Like that's really low number of like repetitions. So how much can you really explore when you're only facing 3 batters? There's not, like, you can't work on very many things if you're only going through 3 batters. So to me, that's where it's all about logistics. You have to have certain prerequisites met before you can actually scale it up to be able to do something that is truly like what this looks like. And that's why I said in a tweet a long time ago, like, ecological dynamics is for specifically baseball, but just in general for sports, is in its infancy. Like, we have not fully fleshed out like what this looks like. And that's where it's really cool. I mean, to me, you do kind of hit a point at some point, maybe, I don't know, where it's like you kind of hit like the gains become more incremental, right? Like we're early enough on the curve that if you do something, the amount of benefit you're going to get from it is going to be, there's a big return for your, and I feel like with analytics, we're kind of hitting that peak too of like, the more you go, the less you get now from it. Whereas before, when we first introduced analytics to the game, like, there were big, massive jumps and advantages that you can get. Not that you still can't. You have to work a lot harder though now to get that. So anyways, that's kind of where I'm going with this, is like, we're still in our infancy when it comes to this of like, so that's at least my start of like 2 very specific examples that are, I think, fairly easy to integrate: batter and an umpire. Very, very simple stuff. I mean, yeah. So those are my basic thoughts.
I'll just jump in quick here, but I 100% agree. Logistics are the issue with the whole thing. So I think that brings up the questions like, one, okay, so you say you can't get a batter, you can't get an umpire. Like, what are the workarounds? Like, how can we still make it more alive? Since I think a lot of people are struggling with that. Like, you look at back some of my TJC posts, and I'll just point that out for anybody who wants to go back and look at those. Like, simple way you could potentially add an umpire in. Like, you have a bunch of pitchers standing around, like, they could become your umpires, and you can tell them what zone you potentially want, especially if you know a certain guy struggles with something, or you just want your pitchers attuning to a different zone. Like, hey, you're going to call ball outside here, right? So give them a ball out every single time, or like, hey, I want a low zone today, and like, you tell that pitcher that, And I think it's helpful for those other pitchers to get the different vantage point, and like they start trying to like, oh, is that a strike? Is that a ball? And they start actually tuning to the zone. I mean, from a different perspective, but at least it's better than just standing around, right? And two, it's like the pitchers who are actually throwing are starting to attune to like the changing zone. Hopefully, they don't always, but now you as a coach can start guiding. Like, hey, what have you noticed about those last two calls on outside? It's like, oh, I got them. Okay, so now that you're 1-2 in this hypothetical count, where could you potentially go? Assuming that he took those pitches and looks frustrated. So you can kind of add those layers in there of like, you can kind of like mention like how the batter's potentially responding. So they're acting at least in accordance somewhat of a problem, even if you don't have a batter. I think the other thing that kind of came into my mind, sometimes you have a really good pitcher, like a dude that's going to blow the guy's doors off every single time, or just has a wipeout breaker or something, and the batter's just not at that level. And I think we talked about that in the in-person, AJ. I think Sean or Tyler brought up the example that they use with some of their NFL guys when they have a guy that was against a college guy who's a lot better, right? But there's ways to give an advantage. Like you can shrink that zone like crazy for that pitcher is a lot better than that hitter, and have them explore new ways of potentially getting out. So you're still expanding their capabilities in a different way, but you're getting better within a smaller zone, which they may potentially face. Or if they don't face it, they just got better in zone. Like they're controlling themselves better in zone, and it gives the hitter a slight advantage, or vice versa, right? Like it could be a hitter way better than the pitcher. Well, okay, the zone's going to expand a little bit. We're going to try to open your capabilities up as a hitter to have to go a little further out. So the simple ways you can manipulate that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think.
What do you think on that? I want to dive into that because I don't love that, and the reason is that hitting is. If a guy's got a good sweeper, like he might chase it anyways. It doesn't matter that you shrink the zone. Like the advantage is still to the pitcher. That's where I don't know how you.
Which example are you talking about? Like shrinking for the pitcher?
Yeah. Well, no. Meaning the advantage is to the pitcher, and generally speaking, the advantage is to the pitcher because, like,
sure.
Where are you going to on the development scale? I think it's easier to develop a pitcher than it is to develop a hitter, just in the current way of doing things, right? We can, pitch design, all this sort of stuff, velo. It's the contactability stuff is not there for hitters yet, as far as I can tell. Like most people are not focused on developing guys who can hit nasty stuff. So if your stuff is nasty, it doesn't matter if if you can't lay off of it. You know what I'm saying? Like it's the advantage is still going to be to the pitcher. Like I don't need to throw it in the zone. He's just going to swing at it. And so, like to me, it's a question of like I guess. Are you
saying like you don't like it for say the pitcher's better than the hitter and we shrink the zone?
Yeah, it's a question of like, okay, how do I play with this idea if we start trying to disadvantage the pitcher to get it more on par so that the hitter has a chance? And the only thing I can think of now, what I'm starting to think about is like I don't know, eliminate pitches. Like the pitcher can't throw a sweep.
Yeah, it doesn't help. Yeah, for sure.
You know what I mean? But that doesn't in the end like. I mean, I will do this for our hitters anyways. Is like I will start to when I'm throwing to them, I'll change. Like I'll limit the number of breaking balls, or I might go fastball heavy. So like there might just be a whole stretch where I just throw a bunch of fastballs. I did this to one guy, like one of our better hitters. He was just struggling he was just always under it. And I was just like, wow, you know what? This is like a game too, right? He's just going to just see fastballs because he can't prove that he can hit it. So I'm just going to feed him fastballs. And I know he's a good enough hitter. Like he'll figure it out eventually. It took him probably like 4 rounds before he actually got it. And then he was on it. And then it turned out like that actually helped him get a little bit in. I mean, I kind of then was more nasty to him afterwards, but it seemed to hold a little bit better. Some of it too is I got in the pattern. And so I like threw him a pitch. I was like, why did I throw that pitch there? He was like, he's hitting those now. So it's kind of interesting. But anyways, my point is maybe to your point of like, I just needed to work through it a little bit of like, okay, how do I gain a little bit more parity when we do have that mismatch? Like it's easy to me to make it harder for the hitter, like I can, even though I don't think of anything offhand, but there are just different ways of like, I move them closer. That's going to automatically make it harder. If a pitcher is struggling, like
depending on what
making this one bigger or whatever, like it's easier for the hitter. But to me, for the pitcher, when the pitcher has the advantage, I think that's harder to help a help give the advantage back to the hitter, or to make it, to level it out, just because it's so much about being able to contact the ball for the hitter.
Yeah, and I think I kind of constrained myself in just using the zone example, but in my mind, like if I'm going to take the advantage away, like I'm going to take away a lot of this, like shrink the zone a little bit. I may have the pitcher now. He's going to explore different ways. Say he's got a nasty sweeper, but he never front doors a sweeper, but that's a way to land it in the zone. So it's like, at the same time, like the hitter's not as good, but I'm expanding his potential options that he may not explore because he's going to get chases all the time away, and he's going to get that outside corner potentially away. But I'm going to take that away, so like the hitter now knows, like, hey, the zone's in a little bit. Don't potentially have to swing at those away. Now the pitcher has to find a new solution. That's kind of where my brain went with something like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's also where I think the athlete co-design comes in as well, where a lot of what we're saying is, what can we change that would make it easier for the batter? Sometimes the batter knows kind of what he's not picking up on, or what he needs. And so kind of putting the keys in his hand to make some changes and recommendations, not only on the complexity side, but I also think it comes in on representativeness side, like giving your athletes the keys of, hey, anytime during this drill, if this doesn't really feel like a game, you have freedom to go make adjustments to this activity to make it feel like a game. Like anything that you do is you're part of this practice design. A coach can set something, and to an athlete, it'll say, this is close, but it's missing this. All right, well, add it in. Like that's all yours to go for and fix. They know what's best because they're actually in the moment doing it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that's a big piece too. It's like, okay, so what do you think we need to take away from the pitcher as a hitter? Like, or like as a pitcher, like, okay, so what should we take away and give you a disadvantage, and see what they come up with, honestly. And then we could potentially play off of that, and they probably come up with better ideas than we as coaches do. And a lot of times they're actually within the environment. The knowledge of is higher than what we're going to have.
And I think too, for the people that might be like the naysayers, partially because this has been my experience a little bit. Like, I think working with pro guys know they have a lot more experience. Working with junior college guys who are just fresh out of high school, yeah, I know, but like there's more percentage, right? But with the guys that I run into, and to your point, AJ, that yeah, sometimes even the pro guys don't really know. But I find that, okay, with the young guys, that I have to remember, they don't have a ton of experience. So therefore, coaches will be like, well, they don't know. Like, I asked them the question, they just don't know. I think I have to remember this too, of like, you have to teach them or invite them to start thinking in this way. They're not going to get it right away. They're not going to have answers for you right away, but it's about the environment that you create, and you keep that invitation open for them to give input. And sometimes you have to override that input, because the other element of it too is like, sometimes guys will just change it to make it easier, and they just want to be comfortable the whole time. So like, you're like, no, it has to be challenging still. Like, you can't just go over there and just, do easy front toss and like easy beeps, like, or just like, for a lot of times too, like guys will just set the machine to something kind of slow that they can just sit there and mash. And it's like, come on, like, we need to, if you actually want to get better, we have to make this more challenging. You got to turn the machine up. You got to let the ball spray a little bit more. Like, you can't just groove it right down the middle. And so like, these are things of like, we have to figure that out of like, what's that balance? Because even too, like, this is from like a parenting standpoint, like I kind of heard this example of like, okay, with the kid, you can't have the reins just pulled real tight all the time. Like, you got to let the reins out a little bit sometimes. So like, there are different, for example, when I did our weighted bats this go around, I made sure that the machine was not set to super hard, because one, if they're going to get the value out of the weighted bats, they need to hit the ball. So if it's too hard and they're not hitting the ball and they're swinging and missing, like, it's like, this isn't working. But I also don't believe like we should be doing, front toss and hitting off a tee either. Like, then I'm building bat speed, but I'm not building the ability to hit the ball. So I wanted something that was, like easy-ish, like close to BP-ish, but maybe just slightly harder than BP. Part of our machine is just going to be that. And so, but I didn't want it to be spraying all over the place, and I wanted it to be something that was doable. So like, what we did is we did like we set the machine at like upper 70s, low 80s. I kind of wanted it at 75, but it ended up being like 77, I think, on average. And then we did a slow breaking ball machine in the other cage. And so I had but the goal was not for it to be nasty. It was just to be something that was doable. And I think there's a time and a place for that, to like find those places where you can let those guys do that comfortable thing, where like, it doesn't matter that it's like super high in a representativeness. It can be a little bit lower, and there can be a space for that. And I think, but you can't let guys just stay there the whole time. I think that's kind of the, that give and take, and finding out like, okay, where can we do those things of like, I can let the reins out a little bit, and you can kind of do that. And I think there is a space for that. So at least I just wanted to put that out there of like, for those people who are like, are you saying that it has to be like this the whole time? Or like, what about this? Yeah, you do have to find that happy balance with guys, and you can't give up on it though. I think that's the biggest thing of like, if you're not getting the response, if you believe in the thing, you can't give up on it. You got to figure out how to foster it. So anything that you want to close on?
No, I think it's a pretty good wrap up. Boy, it was a good, nice little.
You had one other thing. I don't know how much time you have left. Baker, you got like 5, 10, 15. What's your cap?
I think for the safety of my own being, probably like 5.
Okay. I don't know. AJ, do you have like, what is the procedural thing? Question, second half of your.
Yeah, I mean, this is more like out of curiosity, like with you guys, but I was thinking about an after action review, and I was wondering if that's something that's worth it in a team setting. So I'm thinking about, say, a pro or a college program. You obviously go through a game, and then you kind of pick out some certain aspects and walk through it with your team. I wonder if that loses things because, again, you're out of context. You're just kind of watching it on a screen. I was curious if you guys thought that has value. Then maybe it's a conversation for a different day, but that was something that I've been kind of kicking around in my mind recently.
Baker, what are your initial thoughts?
Are you talking like game review?
Yeah, like a game review style of thing where certain things come up and kind of talk about, well, maybe why did we do things this way, or why did this happen? Like, is that useful? I know that in the military, after every single mission, they go through an after action review, things that went well, what didn't go well, what could have gone better. Like, I was curious if that's something that's useful in the sporting context to try to drive some sort of learning based off of what you did, instead of it's like, oh, this happened, all right, we're just going to jump to the next game and just hope it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, no, I think it's extremely valuable, and I think it's how you go through it and what language you use while you're doing it, in my opinion. Really, really matters. Again, I think in baseball, if we're just looking at baseball, your typical one is you're going to be looking at the just specific actions of the athletes. I think that's how it's typically done. And I think there are times where there could potentially have value. But I think that gets dangerous compared to looking through, and you can kind of understand, especially if you're talking through it with an athlete or with athletes, like what they potentially were seeing or why they were behaving in the way they were. And one, you can kind of understand them better, and you can kind of point out things they may have potentially missed where they could go explore in future practices. So I think there's a ton of value in that, and just kind of like fleshing out why things potentially unfolded the way they did, since stuff you won't get in game, because you can't just be with the athlete and ask them what they saw after every play, right? Like why they behaved or what they were connecting to, where that kind of time, what can be helpful. And two, you can point out things that may have potentially been missed, or like, hey, because of this, like you could have potentially, or you could throw it back on them as like, what you have potentially done. And it's kind of like just educating their attention or intention, obviously not on field, but that can be later brought to the practice setting based on what you saw. And it kind of just like gears them into what you may have them interact with later.
No, and I'm right there with you, and I think there's value to it. I just think you have to have some feel as to where and when to put it, because I do think like right after a game, yeah, it's more fresh, but guys are also, depending upon how long the day was, all this sort of stuff, there might not be as checked in, because those things can get kind of long. If you're doing you're doing a good debrief, like that can take some time. So I think you have to figure out where that works best, and like not get too, you have to figure out like, okay, where, I want to touch on this thing after the game, and just spend a little bit of time on this, but there are other things and I'll cover that other stuff. Like it's not as important. You know what I mean? Like there's that nice balance, I think, that you have to figure out of where this lives and how to actually implement it. But I think it's highly valuable. Just for the mere point of like there's value in spending some time like Stu McMillan was talking about, asking that what if question. What if? Like what if we had done this, and playing these different scenarios out so that next time you go out there, you can begin to your attention, you're able to pick up different things in the environment that you weren't able to before, and maybe see ways, different affordances, opportunities for action to be able to interact with that problem differently. Different solutions, might emerge for you. So that's kind of my thought there. Where can people find you guys? If this ends up being an episode like that, where can people find you? What do you guys got going on? I know, Baker, you're back with the Mets, and then AJ, you're currently a free agent trying to find or get connected with folks. And so, where can people connect and see more of your work?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I check it sparingly, but kind of on X or Twitter or whatever it's called, at AJ Ferrara.
Nice.
And I guess for me, it's at Coach G Baker, either Twitter or X or Instagram. Probably I'm more on Twitter more. Honestly, on both of them less now than ever. But I'll still be on both. And email, same thing, coachgbaker@gmail.com. If you want to hit me up on email.
I mean, most people never listen to the end, but you guys should definitely get the Sport Movement Skill Conference 2023 and or any of the other ones. And if you want a discount, use the code EDGE7 to get 7% off. Okay, so there's that plug. Hope you guys found some good stuff out of this and good takeaways. And till next time.